Move to further consideration of the Royal Society of New Zealand Amendment Bill. And members, when we last considered the bill, the debate was on Clause 4, and Grant Robertson had the call, and he has 1 minute remaining.
Mr Chair.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and welcome colleagues back to the Royal Society of New Zealand Bill. Absolutely, it's the highlight of Mr Tremaine's evening and perhaps life to be here for this. When I was last speaking, I was working my way through, Mr Chair, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Royal Society of New Zealand and the Council for the Humanities, because this lies at the heart of this purpose clause of the bill. And essentially what the Memorandum of Understanding has done is bringing together the Council for the Humanities and the Royal Society in a way in which both organisations will be able to work together and to ensure that the kaupapa, the philosophy, the values of the organisations are kept, but that they work closely together. And so I think I had got to the point of saying that the term humanities will be included in all places within the Royal Society's mandate, on their website, and that we will be doing as we work through the bill that's in front of us. Also that in making its representations to government and agencies, the Royal Society will be including humanities wherever that is relevant and supporting particular...
Mr Chair. Grant Robertson, I gave you 5 seconds more than you should have had.
Mr Chair, I'll try and sit down 5 seconds early just to make up for that. So, as I was saying, in making its representations to government and agencies, the humanities, wherever relevant, will be included, and particular representations will be made about humanities. And obviously, in collaboration with the Council for Humanities, which will become the Humanities Committee of the Royal Society, there will be a particular focus on promotion and celebration of the humanities. So I thought it was important, Mr Chair, to be able to put on the record of the House what the Memorandum of Understanding between the Royal Society and the Council for the Humanities means in terms of this particular purpose clause. I think it's a very good document. It gives a solid foundation to the way in which the two organisations will now work together, and it will allow the purpose clause to be enacted. So I think this is a very important document. It shows that the level of collaboration between the Council for Humanities and the Royal Society has been high, and it has been for some time. They are committed to this bringing together. They've in fact largely incorporated most of the work that was required to bring it together, and this legislation is merely the legal requirement on top of that. As I said in one perhaps last point on this Memorandum of Understanding, as I said in the last intervention, one aspect of the MOU is the statement that within 5 years the Royal Society will use its best endeavours to have its Act reflect the inclusion of the humanities. So we're actually well ahead of time, Mr Chair, because this was negotiated in February 2010, and so we have until February 2015 to pass this legislation. And as I said the other day, it might take that long. It probably won't, Mr Hodgson, but we certainly want to give it a thorough consideration this evening and as we work our way through the clauses. But, Mr Chair, I will, at the end of this call, seek the leave of the House to table this MOU, because I do believe it's an important part of the debate. Point of order.
Point of order, Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair.
Leave is sought.
I seek leave of the House to table the Memorandum of Understanding between the Royal Society of New Zealand and the Council for the Humanities.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? Appears. Are you opposed? Appears not. Leave is granted. Members now seeking a call. Honourable Pete Hodgson.
Mr Chair, I think the MOU will be pretty useful, and I hope it will be made available to members soon. I was going to ask 3 questions of the MOU, but one of them has been answered, and that is the date that it's been written in. The second thing is whether or not the MOU was itself subject to any scrutiny by the Academic or the Academy Council or the Academy Executive Committee, and the member and the chair may want to reflect on. I would assume that there's been consultation. I would further assume that in the course of the MOU there would have been, I don't want to use the word argy-bargy, that's not appropriate for the Royal Society, but carefully considered variances of view as people troll through the vicissitudes of their various disciplines to see whether or not incorporating humanities into the MOU and therefore into the purpose of the bill was a legitimate thing to do. So the member may choose at his leisure to give us some insight into the process by which the MOU was drafted. I think the more important thing for members of the House in general is to reflect on the words in the MOU that the member referred to when he said that where it was appropriate, the Royal Society, in making representations to government, would consider whether the humanities had something to offer. And that's an area that I think we need to look at a little more deeply. Later on in the bill, and we're only talking on Clause 4, I appreciate, but when we do get to Clause 7, is it 7? I believe it is. Yes, 7E. There's a function of the Royal Society to provide expert advice on important public issues to the government and the community. And from now on, that expert advice will include the advice that we can divine from the humanities. So let's reflect on what that might be. And a good way to do that is to go to the British Humanities Scholarship Group, the British Humanities Council, the body of people in Britain who involve themselves with humanities. And in an effort, I suppose, to sell humanities to the British public, they produced a book about the sort of information that humanities might offer a government of the day that might be helpful for the government of the day. And the book came out around about the time of the London bombings. And so the book inevitably included a piece of research in which some sociologists and those who want to study the phenomenology of religion spoke at length with the imams of different parts of Britain, so geographical distribution of imams, but also imams from different parts of the world, those who'd come from Pakistan, those who'd come from Afghanistan, those who'd come from Northern Africa, and so on. And was able to give, by way of this scholarship, quite a lot of insight into a nation that desperately needed that insight. And it's a good example, I think, of the humanities being of immediate value to the government of the day. Another example, just to get our appetites whetted, because I'm sure other members will be able to offer the House further examples, but here's one from New Zealand, not England, which is not immediate, but which is historical, and it's occasioned by the sad death of Judith Binney, who, of course, wrote through the latter part of her life extensively on tūhoe. And I don't want to make any politics out of this, but the tūhoe claim is not advancing, or at least has got itself into trouble. And it's my assertion, though I don't know where the future will go on the tūhoe claim, others will know more than I, but it's my assertion that when that claim is settled, people will look back on Judith Binney's work and say to themselves, had she not lived, it would have been a different settlement. And so there's an example, perhaps, at least I'm asserting, whereby one person's scholarship, quite narrowly defined, but then quite extensively done, Mr. Chairman, and quite exhaustively, why, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and most exhaustively written about, will, I'm sure, actively influence public policy in this country that's in front of us. So let's think now about other examples in that area called the humanities, in which we, the government, we, including local government, those of us who are in the policy elite, those of us who are in the polity, those of us who get to do the decision making, will be informed by the humanities in the future and have been informed by humanities until now. Because I'm asserting that we have been treating humanities with ignore, that we've been absorbing their lessons almost in an indirect way, in an unconscious manner, and that the humanities does influence public policy a great deal. This comes from a scientist.
That's right.
So, you know, if you want to know where I have been greatly influenced by science, go to the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification. That's where I drew my public policy from, not from any opening or closing prejudice or predilection or general view of the world, but from the science alone. Why? Because I had nothing else to go on. This was new. I needed to know what the science said. And it was a very good example of where science effected a huge impact on public policy. But very often it does not. And the Royal Society would much rather that it did more often than it did. I'm making the case, not only for science, as a scientist, I'm making the case, or beginning to make the case, for the role of humanities in public policy, and this purpose clause is a good place to do it because the member in charge of the bill has reminded us that the Memorandum of Understanding that exists between the Humanities of New Zealand and the Royal Society of New Zealand to bring them together spoke of the role of humanities when the Royal Society was making representations to government, or indeed was involved in some educative process. So for those of us who think that humanities is nice only, that it is just poetry, think again. Because poetry may not directly affect public policy a lot, but history does, geography does. Just think of the geographic board, you know, the people who go around renaming things. And think of the role of the humanities in us trying to get the nomenclature of our own place in order. It takes a bit of time, and we don't do it without expert advice. So there's another example. I'm sure many members will be able to leap to their feet when I've returned to my seat to give examples of where the humanities has been instructive or has been, in some cases, perhaps even inspirational in determining government policy. So we don't have to always rely on what the health professionals say or what the physicists say or what the educationalists say or what the social scientists or political scientists say. We can reach to the humanities and we can ask historians what they have to say about life. We all have feelings. We can ask people whose skill is with language, who are skilled linguists, what they have to say about that, because we all know that this is the one country in the world where there's a particular language known as te reo, which, if it isn't going to exist here, ain't going to exist anywhere. And so we are absolutely beholden on the humanities for the maintenance of that, the teaching of language to our mokopuna. So there are a bunch of things in which the humanities make a contribution that I think has probably been underrated. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm getting to the view that I soon need to resume my seat, and I have enjoyed this contribution, and I do thank members for their close consideration and careful attention to my modest contribution. Thank you.
I call